My hands trembled when the soldiers lifted me into the carriage. I was only 16. Later, the records would call me Consort Han, one of the Korean women sent as tribute to the Ming palace. But that day, I was simply given away, to the Emperor of China, to a fate no one even bothered to explain. My mother cried as the document was placed before her. She could not write. So she pressed her thumb into black ink and left her mark on the page. One less daughter to feed. One fewer mouth during famine. I watched her choose survival over me. The carriage was sealed shut. 15 other girls were trapped inside with me. We were forbidden to speak. Forbidden to look at one another. Weeks passed in darkness and silence, broken only by the sound of wheels, and the terror of what waited at the end. One girl tried to escape. They dragged her back and crushed her hand. She died days later from infection. Her body was left beside the road. No prayers. No burial. That was when we understood. There would be no mercy. No resistance. Only obedience. When the gates of the Forbidden City closed behind me, I learned the truth. Serving the Son of Heaven had nothing to do with honor. It was imprisonment, disguised as privilege. I would spend 16 years inside those walls. I would watch an entire harem disappear in a single night. I would beg to see my mother one last time. And I would die, wrapped in white silk. My story is only one of thousands. But this is only the beginning. Today, you will learn what desires were hidden behind China's magnificent walls. Walls built on blood, and the ruined lives of the innocent. Subscribe, because what comes next is even worse.
Han's story began the same way tens of thousands of others did, inside a system designed to harvest young women like crops. When people imagine Chinese imperial concubines, they picture elegance. Women in embroidered silk, composing poetry. A life of luxury at the side of the most powerful man in Asia. That image is propaganda. The imperial concubine system existed for more than 2,000 years. During that time, tens of thousands of women disappeared behind the red walls of the Forbidden City. What most people don't realize is this: concubines were not wives. Under imperial law, they were not even considered human. They were classified as valuable objects, legally equivalent to porcelain vases. Every 3 years, imperial officials traveled through the provinces in what they called the Shunu selection. It sounds refined. It wasn't. This was not an audition. It was a forced harvest. During the Ming dynasty, no family was exempt. All unmarried girls of eligible age had to be presented. Hiding a daughter was a crime punishable by death for the entire family. Candidates were examined by eunuchs and palace physicians. Every inch of their bodies was inspected for flaws, scars, birthmarks, imperfections. Any defect meant disqualification. Those who passed were taken. Families received minimal compensation. But refusing the payment was treated as an admission of treason against the emperor. The system didn't need kidnappings. Poverty did the work. And the families left behind? Most never heard from their daughters again. Letters were forbidden. Visits were impossible. In rare cases, if a concubine rose to a high rank, her family might receive a small stipend. But for the vast majority, their daughters simply vanished behind the red walls. Some families held funerals for daughters who were still alive. They understood the truth. The girl they raised was already gone. Han arrived in China as part of a different kind of tribute. Korea sent women to the Ming Empire under diplomatic agreements. Between 1408 and 1435, more than 100 Korean women were sent to the Forbidden City, not as guests, but as property. The moment Han passed through the palace gates, she ceased to exist as a person. She became a number. A possession of the Son of Heaven. But before she could serve, she had to be broken. The selected women were not sent directly to the harem. First came what the eunuchs called refinement, a process lasting anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. The first stage was the destruction of identity. They cut her hair, an act of deep dishonor in Chinese culture. Their names were stripped away and replaced with numbers or generic titles. They were forbidden to speak about their families. Even mentioning their mother resulted in physical punishment. Any personal belongings brought from home were confiscated and burned. The women slept in barracks, 20 to a room. They were woken before dawn and sent to bed only after midnight. For months, they lived in a state of exhaustion so total that resistance became physically impossible. The second phase was submission training. They were taught dozens of different bows. They practiced for 8 hours a day. If a bow was executed incorrectly, bamboo rods were brought down on their legs. Many carried those scars for the rest of their lives. They learned to walk without sound, to keep their eyes lowered, to respond before being addressed, to exist without occupying space, to smile when they wanted to scream. One training manual from the Qing dynasty lists 47 separate rules for standing in the emperor's presence. 47 ways to exist in a single moment. Breaking any one of those rules meant punishment. The third phase was preparation to serve the emperor. I won't describe the graphic details, but surviving documents reveal a systematic process designed to erase all physical and psychological resistance. The women were examined every month. Those judged inadequate were subjected to treatments described in palace records with chilling neutrality. Medical archives record the process with clinical detachment. Notes from 1723 refer to candidates presenting resistance and to preparation protocols requiring multiple sessions. The language is sterile. What it conceals is not. These were administrative records, official documents written as though they were describing the training of animals, not human beings. After months of this, the women who survived were declared ready. Ready to enter a world where their suffering was only beginning. Once training ended, the girls were absorbed into the official system. And with that, a new form of hell began. The hierarchy was ruthless. At the top stood the empress, the emperor's only legal wife. Below her were the imperial consorts. Then came high-ranking concubines, divided into multiple tiers. At the bottom were the common concubines, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, and the preparation women, girls whose fate had yet to be decided. Rank governed everything. How much food you received. The color of your clothing. The size of your room. The number of servants assigned to you. Even the type of dishes you ate from. The empress received more than 22 pounds of prime meat every day. A low-ranking concubine received barely 4 pounds, often less, as provisions were routinely stolen by corrupt eunuchs before reaching the kitchens. Many low-ranking concubines suffered from malnutrition. Their teeth loosened and fell out. Their hair thinned. They aged decades in a matter of years. And the cruelest irony, as their appearance declined, they became even less likely to be summoned. It was a downward spiral engineered into the system. The emperor did not visit his concubines. They were summoned. Each night, a eunuch presented him with wooden tablets bearing the names and portraits of available women. The emperor selected one with a gesture, and the ritual began. The chosen concubine was taken to the bathing palace. Female eunuchs washed and prepared her, but they did not dress her afterward. Instead, she was wrapped in a silk blanket like a parcel, her face left exposed. Why? Because a clothed woman could conceal a weapon. 2 eunuchs carried her to the imperial chamber. At the foot of the bed, they unrolled the blanket. The concubine, completely naked, was required to crawl toward the emperor without lifting her eyes. And here is what almost no one is told. A chief eunuch remained in the room. A chief eunuch remained present for the entire encounter, hidden behind a screen but always there. His responsibility was to keep time. After exactly 30 minutes, he would announce loudly, "It is time to preserve the golden essence of the Son of Heaven." The emperor had to stop immediately. If he did not, the eunuch would enter the room and physically remove the concubine. Afterward, the woman was examined by an imperial physician, who documented every detail. This wasn't for her health. If she became pregnant, there had to be absolute proof that the child belonged to the emperor. But this is where the system became truly perverse. Most concubines were never summoned. Not once. Not ever. There were hundreds of women in the harem, sometimes more than 1,000. The emperor might select 1 or 2 per week. Do the math. A concubine could spend her entire life, decades, waiting for a call that would never come. Aging in silence. Watching younger girls arrive. Knowing that the sole reason she had been taken from her family would never be fulfilled. And still, she could not leave. She could not marry. She could not have children with anyone else. She was property in permanent storage, with nothing to do but wait. The women turned on one another. The imperial harem was not just a prison. It was an arena. Hundreds of women competing for the attention of a single man. All aware that one pregnancy could change everything, or destroy everything. The result was a hidden war that lasted centuries. Concubines poisoned one another's food. They bribed eunuchs to remove rivals' names from the selection tablets. They spread rumors designed to push other women out of favor. Historical records describe women slipping abortifacients into the tea of pregnant rivals. If the child died, so did the mother's future. Long before the Qing dynasty, the same logic ruled the palace. Empress Wu Zetian, one of the few women to rule China in her own name, was later accused of strangling her own newborn daughter and blaming a rival concubine. That rival was executed. Wu rose to power. Historians debate the truth of the story. But the fact that it was believable tells you everything about harem culture. Violence was not always physical. Psychological warfare was constant. Senior concubines tormented juniors. Imperial favorites were isolated and undermined. Alliances formed and collapsed based on who the emperor glanced at during dinner. One Qing dynasty account describes a concubine who spent 3 years pretending to befriend a rival, only to testify against her when the empress launched an investigation into disloyalty. The rival was demoted to servant status. Her children were taken from her. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was survival. In a system where women held no power except through imperial favor, destroying your competition was the only strategy that worked. The tragedy is that the system transformed victims into perpetrators. Women who had been kidnapped, trained, and stripped of their humanity learned to do the same to others, because the alternative was being destroyed first. And if a concubine somehow survived the internal warfare, if she caught the emperor's attention, if she became pregnant, then the real nightmare began. Here is the truth few expect. Pregnancy was the worst possible outcome for a low-ranking concubine. Common sense suggests that bearing the emperor's child would elevate her status. Reality was far more brutal. A pregnant concubine was isolated in the most remote sections of the Forbidden City. For 9 months, she lived under constant surveillance. She could not receive visitors. She could not send letters. She could not walk in the gardens. When the child was born, it was immediately taken from her. If the baby was a boy, he was handed to wet nurses and raised far from his biological mother. She might see him once or twice a year, always supervised by eunuchs, never allowed to touch him. If the baby was a girl, she often vanished entirely. Imperial records rarely bothered to document the fate of daughters born to low-ranking concubines. There are documents describing women so desperate to avoid this cycle that they secretly consumed abortive herbs. They chose the risk of death over bringing another daughter into the system. And if a son died, the mother was often blamed. Accused of negligence. Sometimes accused of murder. Even when children died of common illnesses, the mother could be demoted, exiled to distant palaces, or worse. One Qing dynasty concubine lost 3 children to smallpox. She was accused of harboring poisoned karma and spent the next 40 years confined to a single room, forbidden from seeing any other member of the imperial family. Her crime was burying her children. Her punishment was dying alone. But as brutal as daily life in the harem was, nothing prepared the women for what happened in 1421. In that year, Emperor Yongle had just inaugurated the Forbidden City. It marked the height of his power. Then a rumor destroyed thousands of lives. One of the emperor's favored concubines was found dead. Officially, her death was ruled a poisoning. but whispers said otherwise. They claimed she had taken her own life after an affair with a palace eunuch. And worse, they said the reason was the emperor's impotence. Yongle lost control. Humiliated and paranoid, he ordered an investigation. But he was not searching for truth. He was silencing anyone who might know the rumor. In a single night, 2,800 women of the harem were executed. Not only concubines, but servants, cooks, laundresses, any woman who might have overheard something. The method was death 1,000 cuts, an execution designed to prolong suffering for as long as possible. The executioners were instructed to make it last. Some victims took hours to die. Their screams echoed through the palace complex. Girls as young as 12 were killed. Women who had served the palace for decades. Pregnant concubines. None of it mattered. Anyone who might have known something. Anyone who might have spoken. By dawn, the courtyards had to be washed clean with buckets of water drawn from the palace wells, the same wells where, in later years, countless women would choose to end their own lives. War erases lives. There is no official record of this massacre in imperial documents. The Ming court removed it from history. But one testimony survived. Lady Kuei, a concubine who happened to be outside the palace that night, visiting a sick relative, escaped the purge by chance. Years later, Lady Kuei dictated her account to a Korean envoy. She described screams that lasted until morning. Courtyard slick with blood. Eunuchs dragging bodies through corridors she had walked every day. She named women she had known. Girls she had trained beside. Friends who had shared meals with her. Her testimony was preserved in Korean diplomatic archives, beyond the reach of Ming censors. It remains one of the only first-hand accounts of what happened that night. Lady Kuei herself did not escape for long. When Emperor Yongle died 3 years later, she was among the women selected for accompanying sacrifice. Her final words, also preserved by the same Korean envoy, were simple. "I survived the night of blood, only to die in silk." Han, the young Korean woman from our story, also survived the massacre. She was among the few spared. Her relief did not last. 3 years later, when Emperor Yongle died, Han's name appeared on the list of women chosen for what was called eternal honor. During the Ming dynasty, there existed a practice known as xianzang, accompanying sacrifice. When an emperor died, his favored concubines were buried alive with him. The logic was both simple and horrifying. The emperor would need companionship in the afterlife. And who better than the women who had served him in life? 3 days after the emperor's death, eunuchs compiled the list. Between 5 and 30 women, depending on the ruler. The chosen were given a final lavish meal. Foods they had never tasted. Wine they were normally forbidden to drink. Some accounts describe musicians playing as the women ate, as though it were a celebration. Then came the choice. The first option was to hang themselves voluntarily using white silk cords. This was considered an honorable death. Their families received compensation and official recognition. Some families encouraged their daughters to comply, knowing the alternative was worse. The second option was refusal. In that case, eunuchs would hang the women by force, or drug them with opium until they lost consciousness. Their bodies, some still breathing, were placed seated in chambers surrounding the main tomb. Arranged as if waiting. Attending. Serving, even in death. In 1958, archaeologists opened the tomb of Emperor Jing Tai. Inside, they discovered the remains of 16 women, all seated in surrounding chambers. Analysis showed cervical trauma consistent with hanging. But 3 skeletons bore signs of struggle, fractured bones, scratch marks on the stone walls. They had been buried alive. And they had tried to escape. The practice was abolished in 1464. Not out of mercy, but because the families of the victims were beginning to cause political unrest. Han was not that fortunate. She died in 1424, 30 years before the abolition. When she begged to return to Korea to care for her aging mother, the new emperor denied her petition. She was hanged with white silk and buried beside the man who had destroyed her life. Han's death came before the practice ended. But for the women who came after, abolition did not mean freedom. It meant something almost worse. Concubines who outlived their emperors were sent to the Palace of Perpetual Solitude, remote, isolated corners of the Forbidden City. The rules were stark. Never leave the complex. Never marry. Never contact the outside world. Perform manual labor. Pray for the dead emperor 3 times a day. For decades, they lived in communal dormitories, sleeping on mats on stone floors. Food was minimal. Illnesses were treated only if they threatened to spread. Many lost their sanity. Others simply stopped eating until their bodies failed. The most common escape was drowning in the garden wells. During the 18th century, an average of 12 bodies per year were pulled from those wells. Removed at night. Without ceremony. Without record. Just one less number. The youngest recorded widow was 14. She had been married to an elderly emperor for 3 months before he died. She spent the next 61 years in the Palace of Perpetual Solitude. She was 75 when she finally died, having spent her entire adult life mourning a man she barely knew. The last imperial concubine died in 1946. Her name was Wanrong, the last empress of China. She spent her final years in a communist prison, addicted to opium. Having lost all her children, she died alone at 39. She was buried in an unmarked mass grave. The concubine system officially ended. But the Forbidden City still stands. And what it chooses to remember, and what it chooses to forget, tells you everything. Today, 14 million tourists visit the Forbidden City each year. They walk the golden courtyards. Admire the yellow roofs. Take selfies before the imperial thrones. Tour guides speak of magnificent architecture and imperial power. They do not mention the Palace of Perpetual Solitude. They do not point out the wells where bodies were pulled out week after week. They do not explain why the Palace of Compassion and Tranquility was sealed and used as storage for decades. Officials have long tried to erase the city's haunted reputation without ever asking why it existed. Because some walls still bear the marks of desperate hands. Han was 16 when she was placed in that carriage. She was 32 when they hanged her with white silk. In those 16 years, she never saw her mother again. Never returned to her homeland. Never heard her real name spoken with affection. She was sold as tribute. Trained as an object. Used as a vessel. Buried as an accessory. And she was only one among tens of thousands. Historians estimate that over 2,000 years of imperial China, more than 100,000 women passed through the concubine system. Most of their names were never recorded. Most of their stories were never told. They exist now as numbers in ledgers. As bodies in tombs. As ghosts in palaces tourists photograph for social media. Modern China prefers to celebrate its history without confronting the human cost. It is uncomfortable to admit that the civilization that invented gunpowder and the compass also perfected the industrialization of female suffering. But silence does not honor the victims. Forgetting does not bring justice. The walls of the Forbidden City still stand. The stones still remember. And now, you remember too. If you made it this far, tell me in the comments which part of this story affected you most. And if you believe these stories deserve to be told, subscribe, because there are more buried truths waiting to come to light.